The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth as the sound of hooves resonated across the ranch. Jack Dawson, his heart pounding, ran through the moonlit fields, trying to catch up to the pounding rhythm of the hooves that seemed to echo in the silence of the vast, empty land. His breath came in ragged gasps as he spotted something ahead, a figure, almost ghostly in the distance, stumbling toward him. A woman, disheveled and enormous, her clothes ragged and covered in dirt, was dragging herself through the muddy terrain. Jack's gut tightened. This wasn't a person he recognized. Something was off. His feet pounded the ground, each step heavier than the last. Sweat ran down his face as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. The figure grew closer, her form now more visible in the faint glow of the moon. She moved with a strange, jerky motion, as if she didn't belong to this world. Her face, though weathered and grimy, was eerily calm, yet there was something unsettling about her, something in her eyes. It wasn't just the confusion, it was a deep intensity, as though she knew something he didn't. Jack felt a chill creep down his spine. Who was she, and why was she out here in the middle of nowhere? As she neared, Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Her presence seemed to distort the air around them, making everything feel colder, darker, and more oppressive. Her clothes hung loosely around her, caked in layers of dirt, and her eyes, despite the exhaustion in her body, locked onto his. Jack froze, unsure of what to do. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something anchored him to the spot. He took a cautious step forward, and that's when she spoke. Her voice was rough, hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in years. "I shouldn't be alive, but I am." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a curse. He had no idea what to make of her. This strange, broken woman who appeared from nowhere with the most bizarre statement. He glanced over his shoulder, trying to gauge the distance to his house. Was she dangerous? Did she mean him harm? His hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his back, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. The words reverberated in his mind, making his stomach churn. "I shouldn't be alive." She was talking about death, but she was here, standing before him, alive. He took a step back, his boots digging into the soil, his gaze never leaving her eyes. There was an air of finality about her, a strange, unsettling calmness in the way she stood. Jack's thoughts raced. Was she mad? Had she been out here too long, lost in the wilds of the ranch, and suffered some sort of mental break? But then again, there was something in her eyes, an intensity that spoke of something much darker. His boots made a loud stomp on the ground, the sound echoing in the quiet of the night, but she didn't flinch. The tension in the air seemed to thicken as he stood there, unsure whether to run, fight, or offer help. His body was frozen, caught in a trap of fear and curiosity. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to move, to get away from her, but he couldn't. His face turned pale as he watched her approach slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. There was no mistaking it now. Something was terribly wrong. What did she mean by, "I shouldn't be alive"? How had she survived whatever it was that had left her in this state? Jack felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead as he waited for her to say more, the mystery unfolding around him with every passing second. Jack couldn't tear his gaze away from her. It was as though she was pulling him in, her presence more magnetic than he could explain. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread that flooded his senses, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about her, her words, her appearance, the way the world seemed to bend around her, kept him rooted to the spot. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His mind raced. Who was she really? Why was she out here? What did she want? But before he could find an answer, she took another step closer, and the night air seemed to grow even heavier. The unknown had always been a part of life out here on the ranch, but this felt different, darker, more dangerous. Jack had lived through storms, wild animals, and the harshness of ranch life, but nothing had ever made his pulse race quite like this. His body felt like it was moving in slow motion as he watched the strange woman approach. There were no answers yet, just an overwhelming sense of dread that hung thick in the air. What did she mean by her cryptic words? Why had she appeared here, in the dead of night? And what would happen if he helped her, or worse, if he didn't? The answers were hidden in the shadows, just out of reach. Jack helped the strange woman into his house, his muscles tense as he supported her weight. Her body was heavy and limp, her face drawn with exhaustion and pain. She could barely stand, her legs shaking as she clung to him. He guided her to a chair by the fireplace, offering her water. The dim light flickered over her worn face as she took slow, labored sips. He could see the deep cracks in her skin, the dry lips and the sunken eyes. There was no mistaking it. This woman had been through something unimaginable. Jack had seen suffering before, but there was something different in her, something far darker. As the warmth of the fire began to penetrate her chilled body, the woman, Marilyn, spoke in broken sentences. Her voice was hoarse, almost a whisper, as if she was afraid to speak too loudly. Her words were fragmented, difficult to piece together. I had everything, she murmured. A mansion, a family, a life. I had it all. And then it was gone. Her voice trailed off, the memories too painful for her to continue. Jack listened intently, feeling a deep sense of unease. There was more to her story, something she wasn't telling him. Marilyn looked up at him, her eyes clouded with a mix of fear and exhaustion. They say I died, she continued, her voice quivering. Everyone thought I was dead, but I wasn't. I woke up, but it wasn't the same. Jack's heart skipped a beat as her words settled into his mind. What was she talking about? This woman had somehow survived something that should have killed her, but the way she said it, the conviction in her voice, made him question everything. Who was she really? How did she survive? And why had she come here to his ranch? She paused for a long moment, as though weighing whether to continue. Jack couldn't speak. He was too captivated by her words. Finally, she looked at him again, her eyes narrowing with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. I didn't come back on my own, she whispered. Something darker brought me back. Her words hung in the air like an omen, and Jack felt a shiver run through him. What did she mean by darker? Was she referring to some kind of supernatural force? Or was this a figment of her broken mind? The fire crackled softly behind them as Jack leaned forward, his instincts screaming at him to understand. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice low but urgent. Marilyn's gaze flickered toward him, and for the briefest moment, Jack thought he saw a flash of something that didn't belong in her eyes. It was almost as if she wasn't fully present. Her body was here, but her mind, it felt like it was somewhere else, somewhere far darker. It was a ritual, she said, almost too softly to hear. A deal, with forces I shouldn't have touched. And now I can't escape. Jack was silent, his mind racing with questions. Rituals? Dark forces? He had heard rumors about strange happenings in the area, but he had always chalked it up to old stories, superstitions. Now it seemed those stories were no longer just tales. Marilyn's words cut through him like a sharp blade, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had just stepped into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. What had she done to be involved with something so dangerous? As she sat there, her breathing shallow, Jack realized that the pieces of the puzzle were only beginning to form. Marilyn had once been a woman of wealth, living a life most could only dream of, but something dark had changed that. She was now here, telling a story that didn't make sense but felt eerily real. What had happened in that accident? What had caused her to be declared dead, only to return with memories of something sinister? And if she was telling the truth, what exactly had she brought back with her? Jack stared into the fire, his mind spinning. There were too many unanswered questions, and every answer she gave only led to more. The more he learned about her, the more the mystery deepened. Who was Marilyn before her death, and how was she connected to whatever forces had claimed her life? Jack didn't know what to think, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer dealing with a simple case of a stranger needing help. This was something far more dangerous, and he was in the middle of it. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had tried to probe Marilyn's past, but each time he thought he uncovered a clue, it only led to more unanswered questions. He spent hours searching through old newspaper clippings, legal documents, and even public records, but there was nothing concrete. Her name came up in a few articles, mostly from before her death, but nothing pointed to the woman she was now. It was as if she had never existed in the way she claimed. The more he searched, the more elusive the truth seemed. He felt as though he was chasing shadows, and the deeper he went, the darker the shadows became. At night, things grew even stranger. Jack started hearing faint whispers carried by the wind, a soft murmur just beyond his hearing, as if the earth itself was speaking to him. It wasn't the kind of wind he was used to hearing on the ranch. It was heavier, more purposeful. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just outside the edge of his vision, but there was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being watched never left. His house, usually a place of refuge, began to feel like a trap. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, as though they were alive, pulling at the edges of his reality. The atmosphere became thick with tension, the air oppressive, as if the ranch itself was mourning something it couldn't escape. The weather, too, seemed to reflect this strange shift. It began to rain in torrents, the kind of rain that came with no warning, as though nature itself had turned against the land. Jack couldn't recall a storm ever hitting so suddenly or so violently. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the once tranquil ranch felt like it was being slowly consumed by some unseen force. It was as if the land itself was reacting to the presence of Marilyn, and the longer she stayed, the more the earth seemed to resent her. It was during one of these storms that Sam, a neighbor of Jack's, appeared at his doorstep, his face grim. Sam was the kind of man who didn't often involve himself in the business of others, but something about this situation had clearly shaken him. He offered help, suggesting that maybe Jack needed someone to talk to, or perhaps some assistance around the ranch. But there was something in Sam's eyes, something guarded and wary. He knew Marilyn's story, that much was obvious, but when Jack pressed him for more details, Sam's demeanor shifted. His lips tightened, and he quickly changed the subject, as if the mere mention of Marilyn was something he wanted to avoid at all costs. Jack didn't trust Sam's sudden appearance, nor did he trust the way Sam seemed to sidestep any mention of Marilyn's past. He tried to push further, asking if Sam knew anything about the accident, about the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death, but Sam grew increasingly evasive. Finally, in frustration, Jack demanded an answer, cornering Sam in the barn as the storm raged outside. Sam's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, Jack saw something in him, something almost fear-filled that made him recoil. But before he could press him further, Sam abruptly excused himself and left, offering no more information, only a vague warning. Some things are better left buried. After Sam's visit, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far larger than he could understand. The inexplicable events around the ranch started to escalate. Small items began disappearing from his house. Nothing of great value, but enough to make him question his sanity. A hammer one day, a book the next. His boots, which he left by the door, were gone without a trace. It wasn't just the things disappearing either. Strange sounds filled the silence of the night. Footsteps echoing down the hall, even though Jack knew he was alone. His dog, usually alert and protective, began to act strangely, barking at nothing, staring into corners of the house with an unblinking gaze. The deeper Jack delved into the mystery of Marilyn, the more the ranch itself seemed to rebel against him. The nights grew colder, and the whispers, once soft, became clearer, as if someone was right behind him, speaking just beyond his reach. He couldn't explain it, but it was as though the ranch was alive, breathing in sync with Marilyn's presence. The wind, the shadows, the inexplicable disappearances, everything seemed to point towards something he couldn't see but could feel. Whatever was hidden in Marilyn's past, it was dangerous. Someone or something was going to great lengths to ensure the truth stayed buried. Jack stood at the edge of his land, the storm now just a distant rumble, but the unease in his gut remained. He looked out over the ranch, wondering how much longer he could ignore the signs. The questions kept mounting. What had happened to Marilyn? What was the connection between her and Sam? Why was the truth being hidden so desperately? The more he tried to uncover, the more resistance he encountered. It felt as though the answers were just out of reach, tangled in the very fabric of the ranch itself. And Jack was beginning to wonder if the truth he sought was something no one was meant to find. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Marilyn's presence was no longer just unsettling, it was consuming him. Every time he tried to push her away, she seemed to find a way to pull him back. It wasn't just her physical presence, it was something more, something deeper. Her gaze held an unnerving intensity, as though she could peer directly into his mind. Jack often caught himself thinking thoughts he hadn't intended to share, only to find Marilyn responding to them moments later, as if she had read them in his eyes. It was as if she knew his deepest fears and darkest secrets without him saying a word. The more time he spent with her, the more impossible it felt to separate himself from her pull. The nights grew heavier, and Jack's once peaceful home now felt like a pressure cooker, with the heat of tension simmering just below the surface. One evening, while Marilyn rested in the other room, Jack's curiosity took over. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to her story, something she hadn't shared. It was in the way she avoided certain topics, in the cryptic comments she made. In a moment of desperation, he found himself rummaging through her belongings. Among her things, he discovered a weathered journal, its pages yellowed with age and stained with what appeared to be old ink. As he flipped through it, he stumbled upon the last few pages, which sent a chill crawling up his spine. The journal's final entries detailed something far darker than Jack could have imagined. The words spoke of a forbidden ceremony, one involving dark rites and ancient practices that transcended life and death. The pages were filled with disturbing descriptions of rituals designed to bind souls and grant immortality, practices that went against the very laws of nature. Jack's hand shook as he read, the words growing more frantic and desperate, as if the writer knew they were crossing a line they could never return from. It was clear that Marilyn had been part of something far beyond ordinary human comprehension, something far more dangerous than Jack could have ever guessed. His heart pounded as the room seemed to close in around him. He knew he had to confront her, but part of him feared what she might say. He found her sitting by the window, staring out at the stormy night with an expression of distant contemplation. When he confronted her with the journal, she didn't flinch, but a darkness flickered across her face. "You shouldn't have read that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's stomach twisted as he realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. The journal had only scratched the surface, and now he understood the gravity of what he was involved in. Marilyn's face hardened as she looked at him, her eyes now filled with something cold and knowing. "My family was involved in things that should never have been disturbed," she said, her voice distant. "We were bound by forces beyond comprehension. We sought immortality at a cost." She stood up slowly, the air around her thickening with a chilling energy that made Jack's skin crawl. "And now, those forces have come for me. They want what was taken." Her words hung in the air like a curse, and Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The things she had been a part of, the powers she had invoked, were no longer in her control. They had followed her. "You're not safe anymore," Marilyn continued, her eyes locking onto Jack's with an intensity that made him freeze. "They won't stop until they get what they want, and now they'll come for you too." Her voice trembled, though whether it was from fear or something more sinister, Jack couldn't tell. It was as if her fate had already been sealed, and now his was too. The weight of her words sank into him like a heavy stone, and for the first time since meeting her, Jack felt truly afraid. He had been drawn into something far beyond his understanding, and now he was inextricably tied to it. The room seemed to close in as Marilyn's revelations settled over him. Who were they? What were these forces she had meddled with, and why were they now targeting him? Jack's mind raced with questions, but Marilyn only shook her head, her face pale with fear. "There's no escaping it," she whispered almost to herself. "They've marked you. You need to leave. You need to get away, but they'll find you no matter where you go." She took a step back, as if the mere act of speaking the words made them more real. The terror in her eyes was unmistakable, and Jack realized that the danger was not just to Marilyn. It was now to him as well. Desperation surged through him as he tried to understand what was happening. The world he knew had vanished, replaced by something unexplainable, something terrifying. The ranch, the storms, the strange occurrences, it was all connected. Jack was no longer just dealing with a woman who had survived an impossible ordeal. He was entangled in something ancient, something dark. But the question remained, how could he survive this? Was there even a way out, or was he already too deep in the web? As Marilyn's eyes met his, filled with regret and fear, Jack knew that whatever happened next, his life would never be the same again. The past had come alive, and there was no turning back. The first time Jack saw them, he thought they were just passing through, strangers, perhaps travelers or hunters. But then, the second time they appeared, standing on the edge of his property just beyond the tree line, it became clear that they weren't just lost wanderers. There were 4 of them, tall, gaunt, with cold, calculating eyes that never seemed to blink. They moved with purpose, as though searching for something or someone. Jack's heart began to race as he noticed how their attention shifted toward his house, how they lingered in the shadows, watching him. They weren't here for anything good. The air around him seemed to thicken, a sensation of impending danger closing in. That night, Jack confronted Marilyn. His patience had worn thin. He demanded answers, but she was oddly quiet, looking more withdrawn than usual. When he asked about the men, her face paled, and for the first time he saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. She didn't deny it. She didn't have to. The truth hung in the air between them. "They've come for me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The ones who never stop hunting. They're an ancient order, an occult cult, and they're after me." Jack couldn't make sense of her words. An occult cult. It sounded insane. But the truth was beginning to reveal itself, piece by piece, and the pieces didn't fit the world Jack knew. The following days were marked by a growing sense of unease. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he stepped outside, there was a lingering presence just beyond the horizon. His every move seemed to be monitored, every path he took traced. At night, the wind carried strange sounds, footsteps in the distance, whispers on the breeze, as though someone or something was just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack's ranch, once a sanctuary of peace, now felt like a battleground, his every move leading him closer to the heart of a danger he couldn't understand. It wasn't long before the situation escalated. One evening, as Jack worked on the fence near the eastern edge of the ranch, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, only to see one of the men, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, emerging from the tall grass. Jack's blood ran cold. Before he could react, the man lunged, but Jack was quicker. He grabbed the rifle slung over his shoulder and fired a warning shot into the air, sending the man scrambling back into the underbrush. But that wasn't the end of it. The men were closing in, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. Marilyn. Fear clawed at Jack's throat as he realized the full scope of the danger. This wasn't just about Marilyn anymore. He had become a part of something much darker than he could have ever imagined. The men were relentless, and as much as he wanted to refuse, Jack found himself forced to protect her. Despite his growing distrust of her, despite the mystery and the fear she stirred within him, she was now his responsibility. They were bound together by forces beyond either of their control, and Jack had no choice but to fight. The tension between them had reached its peak. Marilyn, terrified, begged Jack to leave, to escape, but it was too late. The game had already begun. That night, the chase began. Jack and Marilyn ran through the ranch, the moonlight casting long shadows as they darted between barns, over fences, and into the woods. Jack could hear the men behind them, their footsteps growing closer with each passing second. It felt like a nightmare. This was no longer a simple confrontation. They were being hunted. As they reached the farthest corner of the ranch, Jack stopped to catch his breath, heart pounding in his chest. Marilyn grabbed his arm, her fingers cold and tight. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "You're in this now, Jack. They will never let you go." It was then that Jack realized the full weight of his situation. He wasn't just caught in a dangerous game, he was a player in it. The men hunting them weren't just after Marilyn for some forgotten crime. They were part of something much older, much more dangerous. An occult cult devoted to the pursuit of immortality, and now, for reasons Jack couldn't fully comprehend, he was a target too. His ranch, his land, his life, none of it mattered anymore. He was a pawn in a game of power and darkness. Marilyn's presence had changed everything, and Jack's survival depended on his ability to fight back against enemies he couldn't even see. The next morning, Jack found himself standing at the edge of his ranch, looking out at the land that had once felt like home. The men were still out there somewhere. His pulse raced with a mixture of anger and fear. They had come for Marilyn, but now they had come for him too. He couldn't help but feel trapped, as if the walls of the ranch were closing in around him. Jack wasn't just dealing with a few mysterious strangers. He was part of something far more complex and far more deadly than he had ever imagined. As he turned back to Marilyn, standing just behind him, he knew one thing for certain: the hunt had only just begun. The tension between Jack and Marilyn had reached a breaking point. Each passing day brought them closer to a decision they could no longer avoid. Marilyn had been silent for hours, her eyes distant, as if she were weighing the cost of what she was about to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice strained. "To save myself, to stop them from coming after us both, there is only one way," she said, her words hanging heavily in the air. "I must make a sacrifice." Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. The sacrifices she spoke of were never small, and he could sense that whatever she meant, it would cost them both far more than they were prepared for. He stared at her, confused and fearful, unsure of what this would mean for him. Marilyn's expression was unreadable as she looked at him. "My family. They made a deal," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They traded souls, bound to something darker than death itself. The only way to break the pact is for one of us to pay the price." Her eyes met Jack's, and for the first time, he saw the depth of her despair. It wasn't just her own life at stake, it was his too. She had been trying to protect him, to keep him from becoming involved, but now there was no turning back. Jack's mind raced, and he struggled to grasp the weight of her words. What kind of pact had her family made, and what price would she have to pay to free herself and him from the cult's grasp? As the days passed, the urgency of the situation became undeniable. Jack could feel the pressure mounting with every shadow that flickered at the edge of his vision, every whisper carried by the wind. The cult was closing in, their presence becoming impossible to ignore. Marilyn led him to a place she had avoided for years, an ancient abandoned temple hidden deep in the forest. It was a place she had not wanted to return to, but the time had come. As they approached the temple, Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The air was heavy with an ancient energy, a dark force that had lingered for centuries. Inside, the walls were covered with symbols and carvings that spoke of rituals Jack couldn't even begin to understand. Inside the temple, the truth about Marilyn's family began to unravel. The cult, it seemed, had been worshipping a power far older than anything Jack had imagined. Their practices weren't just about immortality, they were about something far more twisted. The members of the cult had once been her ancestors, and their pact with the dark forces had granted them power, but at a terrible cost. The souls of their descendants were bound to the cult forever. Marilyn's survival, her return from the dead, was the result of this pact. She had been brought back not by divine intervention, but by dark magic. And now, she was the only one who could break the chain. The temple was where it all began, and where it would end. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of what Marilyn was telling him. She wasn't just running from the cult. She was the key to ending it all. But in order to do so, she would have to make a final, irreversible sacrifice. "I can't do this without you," she said, her voice filled with a desperation Jack had never heard before. "You're tied to this now, Jack. Your life, your soul, they belong to them too." Her words were a brutal awakening. Jack had thought he was simply helping her, but now he understood that he was already part of this dark fate. The decision was no longer just about her. It was about them both. Could he really accept the price that would save them? Or would they both be consumed by the very forces they were trying to escape? The cult arrived shortly after, their dark figures emerging from the shadows as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. Jack and Marilyn stood together in the heart of the temple, surrounded by ancient stone and the growing presence of the cult members. The air crackled with tension. The cult's leader stepped forward, his face obscured by a hood, but Jack could feel the power radiating from him. "It's time," the leader intoned. "The price must be paid." Jack felt the weight of his own survival pressing down on him, the realization that he was now a part of something much larger than he had ever imagined. His heart raced as the cult members closed in. He was trapped, with no way out. The confrontation was violent and swift. Jack found himself in a brutal fight for survival, struggling to protect Marilyn while trying to fend off the cult members who were closing in from every direction. His body ached from the effort, and blood stained his hands as he fought for his life. But it wasn't just physical strength that would save him. It was his willingness to make a choice. As the cult's leader advanced, Jack realized that this wasn't just a battle of strength, it was a battle of wills. The real test was whether he could accept the sacrifice Marilyn was offering, or if he would be consumed by the very forces that had brought them to this point. In the final moments, with the cult closing in, Marilyn made her choice. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the leader of the cult, and with a single resolute motion, she completed the ritual. The air around them seemed to shift, the oppressive darkness lifting as if the very soul of the temple was being set free. The cult members recoiled, their power waning as the ritual reached its conclusion. Jack stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Marilyn had given herself fully to the dark forces, breaking the pact that had bound her family for centuries. But in doing so, she had sacrificed her own life. As her form began to fade, Jack understood that she had done this not just to save herself, but to free him and everyone else from the cult's grasp. As Marilyn's body disappeared into the ether, Jack was left standing in the ruins of the temple, his heart heavy with grief and confusion. The cult had been destroyed, but at a terrible cost. The truth had been revealed. The dark forces that had haunted Marilyn's family for generations had finally been broken. But Jack's life had been changed forever. He had witnessed a sacrifice unlike any other, one that had torn through the very fabric of his understanding. Marilyn had given everything to save them both, and now Jack was left with the weight of her sacrifice on his shoulders. What came next was uncertain, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same. The aftermath of the battle left Jack breathless, his body covered in bruises and scratches, but it was the weight of his emotions that left the deepest marks. The cult had been vanquished, their dark influence finally broken, but the victory felt hollow. Marilyn was gone, her sacrifice lingering in the air like a painful echo. Jack stood amidst the ruins of the temple, his mind racing, struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. She had given everything to save them both, and yet here he was, alone and shattered, the cost of survival weighing heavily on him. What had she truly saved him from, and what was he really freed from? As Jack walked away from the temple, the silence around him felt deafening. The winds had calmed, but the sense of unease never left. Every step he took seemed to pull him deeper into a world he no longer understood. The life he had known, the peace he had once enjoyed on his ranch, seemed like a distant memory now. His every thought was clouded with questions, his mind racing to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded. The revelation that Marilyn had been part of something so dark, so ancient, was overwhelming enough. But there was more. A final truth that Jack wasn't prepared to face. It was only days later, after the dust had settled and he thought the danger was gone, that the true nature of the cult's reach became apparent. A stranger, a man dressed in black, appeared at the edge of Jack's ranch one morning. He was calm, collected, and his eyes held a knowing gleam. He spoke of the cult's practices, the rituals, the dark history that had been passed down through generations. Jack listened in stunned silence as the man revealed something that made his blood run cold. Jack wasn't just a victim of the cult's machinations, he had been a part of them long ago. The man's words sent a shockwave through Jack. His family, his ancestors, had been deeply intertwined with the occult practices that Marilyn had spoken of. Jack's own bloodline had made its own sacrifices long before he was born. The cult had never truly disappeared. It had been dormant, waiting, and Jack had unknowingly carried its mark his entire life. The man smiled knowingly, as if Jack had only now begun to understand the depth of his involvement. "You were always meant to be a part of it," the stranger said cryptically. "Even your survival was part of the plan." Jack felt the ground beneath him shift, the world spinning as his reality crumbled. As the stranger walked away, Jack was left with a cold emptiness, the truth sinking in like poison. All of it, the darkness, the cult, Marilyn's family, her death and her sacrifice, had been set in motion long before he ever knew. Jack was no innocent bystander in this twisted game. He had been marked, bound to it in ways he couldn't comprehend. And now, with Marilyn gone, there was no turning back. His life was forever linked to this dark legacy, whether he wanted it to be or not. The choices he made had come full circle, and there was no escape from them. He stood on the porch of his house that evening, the sun setting in the distance, casting long shadows over the ranch. Everything seemed the same, yet nothing was. The wind was still, the earth quiet, but Jack felt as though something unseen was still watching him. The world around him had changed, and so had he. The cost of survival had been steep, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered existence. The ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, his prison. His life was no longer his own, and there was no one to turn to for answers. The days that followed were filled with silence. Jack returned to his routines, but they felt hollow, as though he were living someone else's life. The people around him, his neighbors, didn't know the truth, didn't know what had really happened, what had been lost, and what had been sacrificed. Jack couldn't bring himself to speak about it. The truth was too heavy, too impossible to explain. No one would understand, and even if they did, it wouldn't change anything. Marilyn was gone, and the world hadn't stopped turning. He had won, and yet he had lost everything. But even in his isolation, Jack could feel it, the pull of the past, the weight of the choices he had made, and the lingering presence of something darker than he could ever fully grasp. The cult had been defeated, but its legacy was still alive in him, in the land, and in the very air he breathed. The final test wasn't the battle for survival, but the realization that some truths could never be fully understood or escaped. Would Jack ever truly be free? Or had he too become part of something far bigger than himself, forever marked by his choices? The mystery of his fate and the fate of all those involved remained unresolved, hanging like a shadow over everything. Jack didn't know the answers, but he felt them, looming, waiting, as if the story wasn't quite over yet.